This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you could save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at Progressive.com.
Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states.
All episodes of A Trial by Podcast are for informational and entertainment purposes only. Much to their parents' dismay, neither host is a lawyer, journalist, or investigator. Just two people with microphones and Wi-Fi. All actions discussed are alleged, and all parties are innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. For the full legal mumbo-jumbo, check the show notes.
On today's episode of A Trial by Podcast, we are talking about how a 5-foot woman in a hoop skirt out-detectived an entire city of mustachioed men who thought that murder was just a fun Tuesday activity. This is the story of Kate Warne, the absolute legend who saved Abraham Lincoln and then got erased from history like a group chat ex. Welcome back to the podcast, everyone. I am your host, Kelsey, and I've got a little bit of business to get through today before we get to the story. So some of you guys are probably keeping up with the Lindsay Clancy trial, and some of you guys, if you follow me online, saw a recent video where I kind of was just really getting upset about things that I'm seeing online, the rhetoric I'm seeing about this trial. And I said I was going to put out an episode this week covering the trial. I did record a full 70-minute episode, and I listened back to it and I was not happy with it for a few reasons. Number one, I basically was just kind of going off a whim off of notes I've been taking on the trial, because my original plan was to cover the case when the trial was over and we have all of the information. So then I decided, because I was getting really worked up about some of the rhetoric and joking and stuff that I'm seeing online about this case, I was like, never mind, I'm going to do it right now, and then I'll cover it again after, we have the trial, everything from the trial comes out. And so I recorded it when I was really worked up, and I just felt like this was not a good way to cover the case. It wasn't a responsible way to cover the case, and I'm not happy with the episode. I still think there's so much that we don't know that's going to come out in trial. And because this is such a sensitive case, if you don't know, Lindsay Clancy murdered her children. Now, she is on trial for this. However, she does admit that she murdered her children. She's pleading not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect, I believe. So she has admitted that she did this. She has admitted that in her defense. She has admitted that in her civil suit that she's filed against mental health professionals that were helping her. And really, the question when it comes to the legal standard, I'm not talking about moral or ethical questions, was she in a state of psychosis? Did she know what she was doing was wrong, morally, ethically, legally, whatever? And when I cover the case, I will get the exact details on the legal standards. That's kind of where I was at with what I had recorded. I have a lot of the basic points and what is happening, but I want to get the details. I want to cover it responsibly. I want to cover it in a way that I feel good about ethically, and in a way that it is about the case and it's about the facts, and it's not about it's not mainly about my thoughts and feelings on the case, because I do have a lot of thoughts and feelings, but it shouldn't be half the episode. And that's what I had recorded was. So I know some of you guys are going to be bummed in the comments, but it's not about me, and it's not about you guys either. It's about these children who lost their lives. It's about women being failed by the mental health system and postpartum depression, things like that. So it needs to be done well. And I personally feel the best way to do that, the most responsible way to cover this case, is to wait until the trial is over and we have all of the facts. I know there are a lot of big feelings about this case, so that's what I think I am going to do. So that was kind of the business I wanted to cover, just because I don't want to say I never make empty promises to you guys, but I did post that I was going to cover it in the next week or two, and I am not going to. So I apologize for that. I feel like you guys will probably understand, hopefully with my explanation, why I've changed my mind, and I'm doing my best to not get so worked up and just start posting so quickly. But if you guys have been following this trial, no matter what side you're on, I think you can understand why I got worked up about it. But with that being said today, after doing that research and that recording and everything with that trial, I needed something a little bit lighter of a topic, a little bit less soul draining. So today I found what I think is a fun story, and I'm going to do this caveat once, and I'm going to do it once only, because otherwise I'm going to have to repeat it 500 times throughout this episode. We are talking about Kate Warne, who basically saved Abraham Lincoln from an assassination attempt. And I think this is a fun story. I made the script funny. There's going to be a lot of jokes. There's going to be a lot of zingers. And I think we can do that because it's a historical story. This happened, almost 200 years ago. However, I want to make it very clear, the context behind this story, when we talk about the setting, this happens leading up to the Civil War. This is when slavery is active in America. This is when the North and South are really coming to a head when it comes to the issue of slavery. And I want to make it very clear, I understand this is a very important point in history. It's not a joke. I'm not making a joke of the Civil War. I'm making this story itself funny. And I really appreciate the gravity of the setting that this story takes place in. So there's going to be little quips here and there. And if that's not for you, I totally understand that. But I want to be clear. I just want to have fun with this story. Okay? Someone's still going to be mad at me and say I shouldn't do that, but that's what we're going to do, guys. But let's jump into the story. And I want you guys to picture this. It's 1861. America is having what can only be described as the world's messiest breakup. The North and South are about to irreconcilable differences their way into a 4-year bloodbath. Everyone's got a mustache the size of a small woodland creature, and the president-elect of the United States is about to get smoked by assassins in Baltimore before he even makes it to his own inauguration. And who saves him? Not a general, not a spy with a cool code name, not some big burly guy with a jawline that can cut glass. It was a woman. Cue all the gasping sounds. A woman? What do you mean? Not just a woman, a widow. A 5'0" detective named Kate Warne, who basically walked into the most sausage-fest profession in American history, being an armed federal adjacent detective in the 1850s. And she basically walks in and she's like, yeah, I'm probably going to be better at this than most of you guys. And then she was. She delivered on that. She walked in with confidence and she delivered. On the morning of February 23rd, 1861, a train pulled quietly into Washington, D.C., hours ahead of schedule and without the fanfare that should have accompanied the arrival of a president-elect. Abraham Lincoln, dressed not in his customary black suit, but in a soft felt hat and an overcoat draped like a shawl across his shoulders. He stepped out of the car and into the Capitol unannounced. There's no brass band to greet him, no cheering crowd, no ceremony befitting the man about to take the oath of office. There was instead a tired detective named Allan Pinkerton, a bodyguard named Ward Hill Lamon, and a woman who had spent the entire night awake in a train berth, watching over a man the world did not yet know was sitting beside her. That woman was Kate Warne. She was 31 years old, a widow, an actress by temperament, if not by trade, and surprisingly, for a country that would not grant women the right to vote for another 60 years, she was the first female detective in the history of the United States. Warne did not carry a badge that history remembers, and she left behind no diary, no memoir, no photograph with her handwriting on the back of it to tell us who she really was. What she left behind instead was a single extraordinary night in which her composure, her intelligence, and her willingness to do a job that no one thought a woman could do may have altered the entire course of American history. Had Abraham Lincoln been assassinated in Baltimore in February of 1861, before he ever took the oath of office, there probably would have been no Emancipation Proclamation, no Gettysburg Address, no 13th Amendment signed under his hand. The Union that fought and won the Civil War as we know it may have never existed at all. This is the story of how Kate Warne helped all of that happen, and of the largely undocumented life that led her to a moment when the safety of a nation rested in no small part on the nerve of one woman traveling under a false name. Now, piecing together Kate Warne's early life is really like trying to solve a cold case with no body, no witnesses, all of the reporting in a different language, and half the files destroyed by an actual fire, which annoyingly is literally what happened. So most of Pinkerton's agency's paperwork actually went up in flames during the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, which happened 3 years after Kate Warne died. So we're left kind of squinting at the historical equivalent of a redacted document, trying to piece what we know together without all of the information. What we do know about Kate's early life is that she was born around 1833, maybe 1830, in Erin, New York, to a family with more integrity than income. Even her birth year, like I said, is a mystery. We don't know exactly what year she was born, which feels almost too on the nose for a woman who would spend her career finding these types of things out about other people, like things that they didn't want people to know, things that they wanted to keep hidden. And now we're trying to find out stuff about her life, and we're not able to piece it all together. Now, according to Kate's family, as a kid, she wanted to be an actress, but her family said, absolutely not. That's not a real job. You have to go find something actually respectable, which is kind of like the 1840s version of, have you considered becoming a nurse? Which, shout out to all the nurses out there. That's awesome for you guys. You guys are amazing. We need and appreciate you, and you guys are undervalued. However, there are a lot of us who would be fucking horrible at being nurses. So Kate listened to her family, and she shelved this dream. She did what she was supposed to do. She got married, but she was widowed by her early 20s. We believe by the time she was about 23 years old. And this man is completely anonymous. We know for sure that she was married, but he's kind of like literally ghosted. We don't even have his name. We don't know who her husband was. But after she was widowed, Kate packed up with her parents and her brother and moved to Chicago, because nothing says a fresh start like relocating to a booming railroad town in your widow's black, which, if you don't know, historically, when someone would die close to you, especially your spouse, you would wear black for a long time, like not just the day of the funeral. And it was to show that you were still in mourning, which to my understanding meant that no one else should be pursuing you because you're in mourning over your spouse. So wearing widow's black would show other men like, she's mourning her husband. Please don't hit on me. Now, once in Chicago, Kate took a job cleaning houses, which by all accounts, she was not really thrilled about this. Scrubbing baseboards wasn't exactly the emotionally rich acting career that she had envisioned as a kid. Then, in 1856, 23-year-old Kate opens up the newspaper and she sees an ad for a job. And that job was as a detective at the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Now, this was a job for men, and it probably didn't say that in the ad. It was just common knowledge. Everyone knew that this wasn't something a woman could do. No way. Now, the Pinkerton Agency was owned by a man named Allan Pinkerton. Awesome detective name. Very good. 10 out of 10, no notes. Love it. Now, a little fun side note is that the logo for his agency was actually an open eye. And the logo stated their motto, which is, "We never sleep," which is, that is a fantastic motto for a detective agency. And not motto, the slogan. Their company slogan was, "We never sleep," with this open eye. So if you've ever heard the term private eye, this logo is actually where that term comes from. A private eye, private investigator. It comes from this Pinkerton logo. And just a little shout out to the man, whoever created that logo, whatever graphic designer out there created that. That is some good branding. If we're talking about it almost 200 years later, fantastic branding. We should give this guys a raise posthumously. I don't really know how to do that. We can do like a seance or something. Unfortunately, I do not have this man's name, but like good graphic design, good slogan, whoever did that, just great branding overall, no notes. But Allan Pinkerton takes one look at this young widow standing in his office, and he assumes, which was kind of reasonable for the time, that either she's lost or she's here looking for some sort of secretarial job. He's got plenty of women working in the office already, but they're filing paperwork, they're receptionists, they're secretaries, they're scheduling meetings, they're taking phone calls. But what he does not have, what no detective agency in America has ever had at the time, is a female detective, because it simply, as he put it, was not the custom. It's that time of year where everyone is coming over. Cookouts, get-togethers, and people asking for water with ice. And I actually deeply care about what I'm handing my guests. I'm trying not to Julia Tofana anyone. If you know, you know. And that's the thing. I just moved into a new place. The tap water looks perfectly fine, smells perfectly fine, looks crystal clear. But that's the thing is, looks can be deceiving. Your water might look completely fine straight out of the tap, like crystal clear. But 3 out of 4 U.S. homes have toxic chemicals in their tap water. And guess what? You're not going to 3 out of 4 U.S. homes and seeing water that looks funky. It just looks like water. But just like Aqua Tofana, there are things in there that you can't see, smell, or taste. Your standard fridge filter or pitcher filter isn't catching most of them. So this summer, I've been running everything through AquaTrue. It sits right on my counter. There's no plumbing. There's no installation. You just have to plug it in and go. It's tested and certified to remove 84 contaminants using its patented 4-stage reverse osmosis system. So when someone asks for a glass of water at my new place, I feel good handing it to them. So if you're ready to make the switch, head to aquatrue.com and use promo code ATrialByPodcast for 20% off your purifier. That's AquaTrue, AQUATRU.com. Promo code ATrialByPodcast for 20% off. We are officially in the dog days of summer, which when you were a kid, that meant a lot of freedom. No school, no teachers, no homework, no nothing. But as an adult, that freedom is taken away from us, ripped from our hands, shred by shreds as we beg for it back. Meanwhile, it's 95 degrees out, and you're probably just dying for one day of freedom and a nice cold summer cocktail. Maybe a mojito, maybe a margarita if you're feeling spicy. But who could afford it in this economy? Especially when Big Wireless is charging you an arm and a leg for your wireless service. That's why summer is the perfect time to switch to Mint Mobile. With their summer sale, you can spend just $15 a month for high-speed data and coverage on the T-Mobile 5G network. Mint Mobile took what's wrong with wireless and made it right with premium wireless for just $15 a month, so you can free up those dollars for something a little more fun. All plans come with high-speed data, unlimited talk and text delivered on the nation's largest 5G network. So stop spending on wireless and spend on margaritas, if you so choose. Go to mintmobile.com/atrialbypodcast to switch. That's mintmobile.com/atrialbypodcast. Upfront payment of $45 for 3 months, $90 for 6 months, or $180 for 12 months. Plan required, $15 per month equivalent. Taxes and fees extra. Initial plan term only. Greater than 50 gigabytes may slow when network is busy. Includes up to 20 gigabytes hotspot. Capable device required. Availability, speed, and coverage varies. See mintmobile.com.
Insurance isn't one size fits all. That's why customers have enjoyed Progressive's Name Your Price tool for years now. With the Name Your Price tool, you tell them what you want to pay, and they'll show you options that fit your budget. So whether you're picking out your first policy or just looking for something that works better for you and your family, they make it easy to see your options. Visit Progressive.com. Find a rate that works for you with the Name Your Price tool. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law.
Kate hears this because she's telling him, no, I'm here for the detective job. She pretty much says, cool, I get that it's not the custom, but I'm not here to file paperwork. I'm here to be basically a spy. Kate explains to him that she offers something a lot of male detectives don't. And that is the fact that she would be less suspicious than any sort of man. Because again, who would hire a woman as a detective? That's ridiculous. She explains to Pinkerton that no one will ever see her coming. Now, Pinkerton later wrote that she had a, quote, broad, honest face, end quote, and a fire in her eye, which is basically Victorian language for she has main character energy and I couldn't look away, and she was walking in like a boss-ass bitch. Because she was right. No one suspects a woman at the time. She could cozy up to a criminal's wife, his girlfriend, his mistress, him, whoever, and they could hand over secrets over tea, because who's afraid of this nice little lady in a bonnet? Kate explained to Pinkerton that men were only good at investigating other men, but not women. And this was frankly a killer pitch. And Pinkerton, by his own account, was genuinely flummoxed. That was the word he used, which I love. But he's completely flummoxed and he's convinced. He hires Kate that same day. And just like that, Kate Warne became the first female detective in United States history. Now, I should note, I've been learning a lot as an adult, and it seems that a lot of United States history that we learned in history class and in American schools is a little bit wishy-washy. So as far as I know, as far as I could find, she was the first female detective in U.S. history. A full 35 years before American police departments would even consider letting a woman near a badge. And she did not coast on the novelty of this. She delivered. In 1858, she sent to Alabama to catch an embezzler named Nathan Maroney, which sounds like a very classic old school criminal name, using the extremely elegant strategy of becoming his wife's new best friend and slowly, charmingly worming the truth out of the wife with what was probably a lot of tea and gossip. Like, I picture that these ladies, they're literally spilling tea. She also, at one point, went undercover as a fortune teller because apparently detective wasn't a big enough costume change for her. And she used this fortune teller costume to get a suspect talking. By 1860, Pinkerton was so impressed that he put her in charge of an entirely new division, the Female Detective Bureau, making her not just America's first female detective, but its first female detective boss of other female detectives. In 4 years, she'd gone from mopping floors to running a unit of female spies that she created. Then, February of 1861 rolled around, and the country needed her to keep the next president alive. So to set the scene, it's the winter of 1860, rolling into 1861, and America's having, to put it mildly, a fucking moment. Lincoln wins the presidency in November on a platform of, hey, let's not expand slavery and be evil, 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 horrible, evil people. And the South's response is essentially to flip the table and storm out of the restaurant. Now, South Carolina secedes in December, like it's breaking up with the country via text, just like, you know what, we're out of here. They didn't fully ghost, they did give notice, but they're like, we're out of here. And by the time that Lincoln boards a train in Springfield, Illinois in February to head to his own inauguration, 6 more states have followed South Carolina out the door. And the Confederacy has already formed itself into an entire breakaway nation. And Lincoln, a man who hasn't even been sworn into office yet, is arguably the most despised person in half of the country in this new Confederacy. He's getting death threats basically daily. And this is kind of a tough way to start a new job when you're just trying to fight for the freedom of Americans. So knowing that he is the most hated man in the country by a lot of people, what's the security plan here? What's the protocol? Well, of course, it was a 2-week, widely publicized, extremely leisurely train tour through Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, and finally D.C., with scheduled public appearances at practically every stop, so that anyone who wanted to know exactly where Lincoln would be and when could simply read a newspaper, find that information, and go there and track him down. It is, from a bodyguard's perspective, an absolute fucking disaster of a plan. It's like publishing your assassination target's GPS coordinates out of politeness. Now, the city that made everyone around Lincoln the most nervous was Baltimore, and for good reason. It was a slave state city crawling with secessionist street gangs and paramilitary clubs who were extremely open about which side they were rooting for, the fucking evil one. Sorry, guys, there's going to be some F-bombs in here. I apologize. I'm trying to swear a little bit less. But it's just like it's hard for me to casually just glide over people fighting for slavery without throwing in an F-bomb. But yeah, making it worse, Baltimore's train system was designed apparently by someone who hated commuters because the northern and southern rail lines didn't connect. Passengers had to get off one train and get physically hauled by horse-drawn car about a mile across the city in order to get on the next train, meaning that for one exposed, crowded mile, the president-elect of the United States would basically be a pedestrian. Now, the Pinkerton agency didn't even get looped in because of Lincoln's own people. They got hired because a railroad executive got spooked by all of this. So this executive's name was Samuel Felton, and he ran the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad. And he caught wind that there was a brewing conspiracy against Lincoln. So in late January 1861, he brought in the Pinkerton agency to look into this conspiracy. And by February 3rd, Pinkerton had rounded up his best people: Kate Warne, Hattie Lawton, Timothy Webster, Harry Davies, and Charles Williams. And he sent them down the rail line to sniff out whether this was a real threat or just a lot of angry men yelling at parties about what they want to do. Now, the team worked their way down through Wilmington, Perryville, Havre de Grace, and they found mostly what you'd expect. A lot of Southern rage, not a lot of actual planning. Baltimore, though, was where things were getting real. There, Pinkerton's people found evidence of an organized group, possibly tied to the delightfully theatrical-sounding Knights of the Golden Circle. They called themselves the Knights of the Golden Circle. So not only are they evil, they're fucking losers. Okay. Now, they were actually actively plotting something against Lincoln when he came through Baltimore. And this is where Kate got to cash in on the exact argument that she had made to Allan Pinkerton 5 years earlier. She reinvented herself again. This time, she was a Southern belle named Mrs. Cherry, and later, Mrs. M. Barley. And she was complete with a Southern accent and her secessionist cockade pinned to her dress like she was cosplaying a cause she couldn't have cared less about. I know that was a horrible accent. I'm going to stop that now. So in this getup, she gilded through Baltimore's secessionist. Is it secessionist or successionist? Guys, if it's in my mind, I just read it as secessionist and I didn't question it at all until I read it out loud like 5 times. And I just have to say, if it's successionist, I'm not re-recording all that. Let's see. Haha. Damn, your girl's so smart. It's secessionist. Oh, thank God. Okay. Well, I'm going to leave that in so you guys can have a good laugh. It's just sometimes you say a word so many times, it doesn't sound like a real word anymore. So that's where I'm at. So in this get up, Kate starts gliding through Baltimore's secessionist social scene. That's a mouthful. So she's attending these fancy parties at Barnum's Hotel, cozy chats with the wives and sisters and sweethearts of men who thought that they were founding a new evil piece of shit, evil country. So throughout all of this, throughout this social scene, she's there basically collecting gossip, collecting the tea that was, unbeknownst to any of them, about to blow their entire plan wide open. And it's genuinely funny to me to imagine this room full of men convinced that they're being so careful, so secretive, while the nicest lady at the party, which can only be so nice when you're fighting for the Confederacy, but the nicest lady at the party is quietly clocking every detail that her husband told her in bed and reporting it back to the Pinkerton agency. And it was in exactly those rooms, the ones that male detectives could never have gotten into without immediately being side-eyed. Those rooms are where Warne was able to piece together what this actual plan was. And that plan was for the conspirators to hit Lincoln in that mile-long gap between Baltimore's 2 train stations. They were going to do this by staging a fake brawl nearby, just to pull away what little police protection Lincoln was going to have on that mile. And then, in the midst of this chaos, they were going to strike. And just to make it extra stressful, it turned out that some of Baltimore's own police leadership, it seemed like they were probably in on it too. It's not 100% confirmed, but it seems like some of them were in on it, which meant you couldn't even just solve this problem by sending in more cops. Like, some of the cops themselves were part of the problem. So Warne brought everything she had gathered straight to Allan Pinkerton, and in a nice bit of dramatic irony, the intelligence gathered by other detectives at the agency came in from General Winfield Scott through William Seward, who landed on the exact same conclusion at the exact same time. So these two different stories collected by William and by Kate confirmed that this was not paranoia. Someone was going to be waiting for Lincoln in Baltimore. And now came the hard part. What were they going to do to stop this? Abraham Lincoln was on his way to his own inauguration to be sworn into office as the President of the United States. And again, the concern was you can't just bring in more security because you don't know who is in on this. You don't know who is on the wrong side of history here. So what were they to do? How were they to protect this man who was going to change the history of this country? Well, it wasn't by dodging any sort of assassins. It was by talking Abraham Lincoln into wearing a disguise. Now, when Pinkerton and Warne sat him down in Philadelphia to explain the situation and explain their plan, Lincoln's reaction was basically like, yeah, no, absolutely not. I'm not sneaking into my inauguration like I owe someone money and I'm trying to get away. But it was kind of a necessary evil because the man was 6'4". He had a face that everyone in America could recognize on sight. And he was deeply allergic to looking scared. He didn't want to look afraid, especially when the country is divided. And while I'm normally the first one to call a man hard-headed and stubborn, I see his concern here, right? His concern is, hey, it kind of looks like we're going into a civil war. I can't look like I'm just like shying away from it, especially when he wasn't fully convinced that there was a real threat in Baltimore. So he grilled Pinkerton and Warne with question after question, clearly hoping to poke a hole in any part of this story that would convince him it wasn't true. And it wasn't until Pinkerton and Warne laid out exactly what Warne had heard in those Baltimore parlors that he finally reluctantly caved. And once he caved, the entire plan became Kate Warne's problem to execute. And that plan was basically no daylight train allowed, no announced schedule of when he's going to be on this train, no full presidential entourage strolling him through Baltimore like a parade float, which, again, this entourage is usually there to be his protection. But it's kind of obvious when you just have like a giant group of people all together. Instead, the Pinkerton agency's plan was to sneak him in the middle of the night on a train that no one was expecting. That wasn't even a part of the train schedule. And to disguise him well enough that even the people actively looking for him would look right past him. So on the night of February 22nd, Kate Warne buys tickets for the rear car of an overnight train under the name of a made-up sick man traveling with his family. Now, that sick man is, of course, going to be the president-elect of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, who has been talked against every fiber of his being and dignity into swapping his iconic stovepipe hat and coat for a soft little traveling cap and a shawl thrown over his shoulders like a grandmother heading to bingo. It is, by every account, an extremely undignified look for a man who is about to run the country, and he knew it. It wasn't something that would have been respectable for him to be seen in. Now, Ward Hill Lamon, who is also from the Pinkerton agency, climbed aboard armed with 2 pistols and a knife because apparently his security plan was become a one-man armory at this point. Pinkerton came along too, but it was Kate who had the role that actually mattered. She played the devoted older sister escorting her poor, frail brother home for medical treatment. A cover story so boring, so unremarkable, that nobody in their right mind would give it a second glance, which was, of course, exactly the point of all of this. Kate had booked out the whole sleeping section under the story specifically so no stranger would end up close enough to get a good look at her big brother's face. And then, for the entire night, while the train rattled toward the one city where a small mob was allegedly hoping to kill Abe Lincoln, Kate Warne did not sleep. Not a wink. She barely closed her eyes. She sat up next to Lincoln the whole ride, watching the car, watching the passengers, and reportedly keeping a hand near her own weapon just in case anyone got curious. And I think, like, just take a moment and picture this. The soon-to-be president of the United States, dressed like he's sneaking out. He's just fast asleep, or maybe pretending to be, who really knows, while a foot-tall female widow in her early 30s sits guard beside him, like the world's most competent, most underpaid bodyguard. Now, while these days we all know that this is an appropriate job and place for a woman, this was unprecedented for the time. But still, there she was, and that train slid through Baltimore in the dead of night. They were able to switch stations without a hitch, and not one of the plotters ever clocked that their target had already slipped past them hours before they even showed up to look for him. So by the next day, when Baltimore's secessionist crowd gathered at the depot fully expecting a shot at the president-elect on his publicized schedule, they had already missed him. Lincoln was already in Washington, having strolled off the train early with Pinkerton and Lamon, while Kate, mission complete, quietly vanished into the background of history. No fanfare, no thank you parade, nothing. But, and it almost seems anticlimactic, but that's the point of this story. There was no climax. There was no assassination. And on March 4th, 1861, Abraham Lincoln stood on the Capitol steps and gave his first inaugural address, closing with that famous line about the better angels of our nature. Now, Lincoln's first inaugural address was less of a triumphant victory speech and more of a carefully worded olive branch aimed almost entirely at the South. And this was really a last attempt to keep the country from tearing itself apart before a shot had even been fired. He opened his speech by trying to diffuse the panic directly, telling Southern listeners plainly that he desired to preserve the Union and not interfere with slavery, going so far as to quote his own earlier words back to them. He said, quote, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so," end quote. And this was, in effect, Lincoln telling the South, I am not the abolitionist boogeyman that you've built up in your head. And I think this is important to point out because I don't know, other Americans, you guys can sound off in the comments how you feel you were taught about Abraham Lincoln in school. And obviously, I'm 30 years old, so it's been a long time since I was being taught about Abraham Lincoln at school. But I want to make sure that we are not giving Abraham Lincoln more credit than is deserved, aka telling the facts about history wrong, because obviously Abraham Lincoln is dead and does not care about credit. So in this speech, he is extending this olive branch, trying to basically stop this civil war that is looming. But his reassurance only went so far. He also made it clear that he did not consider secession legal at all, arguing that the union of the states is perpetual and that no government has ever built in a provision for its own termination. He pledged to hold, occupy, and possess federal property while promising the government would not be the first to use force. But he warned that any armed move against the United States government would be treated as rebellion and be answered accordingly. He framed the entire sectional crisis in alarmingly simple terms, noting that one half the country believed slavery was right and should be extended, while the other believed it was wrong and should not be, calling this the only substantial dispute between the two sides. He used the word union 20 times over the course of the speech, hammering the point that this was not a negotiation over slavery so much as a referendum on whether the country itself got to survive. Now, we can debate his motives to the end of times, but the practical record of Lincoln's presidency is enormous, and it's worth laying out plainly. He preserved the Union through 4 years of civil war that killed more Americans than any conflict in the nation's history before or since. He issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. Now, this was limited in its immediate legal reach because it only applied to Confederate territory not under Union control. And this Emancipation Proclamation is what reframed the war as a fight over slavery itself and paved the way for roughly 4 million enslaved people to eventually be freed. Now, here's the thing. This is another thing I feel like in American schools, you're kind of taught like the Emancipation Proclamation was kind of the end of slavery. And I don't think they're teaching it that way now. And honestly, I don't know for certain. Again, it's been, I don't know, I was probably learning about this in elementary school. But for anyone who is from a different country or maybe is in the US and does not know, this is where the Juneteenth holiday comes in. Because though the Emancipation Proclamation freed almost 4 million enslaved people, this was not the end of slavery in the United States. According to Britannica Online, quote, more than 2 years passed, however, before enslaved African Americans living in Texas, some 250,000 were freed. It was not until Union soldiers arrived in Galveston, Texas on June 19, 1865, and were able to enforce the edict that the state's residents finally experienced freedom, end quote. So that is why Juneteenth is and will remain to be celebrated as a federal holiday, because June 19th is when the last of the enslaved people in the United States learned that they had been freed. 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, Abraham Lincoln did also push for and saw the early passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution through Congress in January 1865, which permanently abolished slavery nationwide. Now, beyond the Civil War and the institution of slavery that existed horrifically here in the United States, his administration also passed the Homestead Act, which opened millions of acres of Western land to settlement, the Pacific Railway Acts, which set the Transcontinental Railroad in motion, and the Murrill Act, which created the land-grant college system that still funds major public universities today. He also delivered, almost incidentally, some of the most quoted political language in American history. The Gettysburg Address, chief among them. So while I could go on and on about Lincoln's role in history and how it is debated, this story is not really about Lincoln. It is about Kate Warne, the woman who not only held an unprecedented role, but helped make everything that I just talked about, the good and the bad, possible. And in the interest of being a responsible podcast host and not just a hype woman for Kate Warne, I gotta be clear with you. The Baltimore plot is not, historically speaking, an open and shut case, because basically all of this evidence came from undercover spy work, people at parties overhearing things. And a lot of this is hearsay. This is not a signed confession or a stack of like confiscated murder weapons and people being caught red-handed. While Lincoln survived the night, no one was ever arrested. No one was ever put on trial. And some historians have spent the last almost 2 centuries going, okay, was this actually real, or did everyone just get really spooked at some parties in Maryland? Now, whether or not Kate Warne stopped a real attack that was going to end the life of Abraham Lincoln, we'll never know. But that's kind of the point, is to take action. It's better to not know than to have a definite conclusion because the man is dead. And if you're wondering why we're talking about Kate Warne today after this, well, she probably saved Abe Lincoln point, is because the story, again, is not about Abe Lincoln. It's about what Kate Warne did. And after probably diffusing this plot to kill Abe Lincoln, she did not decide to just take it easy. She kept working for Pinkerton throughout the entire Civil War, at which point the agency had basically transformed into an unofficial spy network for the Union. Allan Pinkerton was essentially running a scrappy DIY version of what would eventually become the Secret Service, minus all those sunglasses and cool earpieces. Warne kept running her female detective bureau the entire time, recruiting and training women who went on to do actual undercover espionage inside Confederate territory, which is an insane sentence to type about the 1860s. Again, unprecedented. They were the fucking goats, and they were the first to do it. Now, unfortunately, because this was espionage, by nature, we don't have many of the specifics about what Warne herself and her female detectives were up to during those years. This operation ran on secrecy as a matter of principle. And the records that we did have, remember, a lot of them burned up in the Chicago fire in 1871. But every surviving account agrees on one thing. Kate Warne was Allan Pinkerton's most trusted employee, his self-described right hand, which is a pretty solid promotion path for a woman who walked in off the street in 1856, asking for a job that didn't technically exist yet. Now, Warne never remarried after being widowed in her early 20s, and she never left the profession of espionage, of being a detective. She kept working right up until her health started failing in the winter of 1867, and she died on January 28th, 1868 in Chicago, officially of pneumonia, though historians suspect it was probably something longer brewing like tuberculosis. Kate was only in her mid-30s at the time of her death, which is genuinely a rough way to end a story this good. Again, a woman in her mid-30s in the 1860s, dies in the 1860s, accomplishing all of this in her life is absolutely fucking mind-blowing. Now, Allan Pinkerton, for his part, was wrecked by Kate's death. He didn't just bury her in some regular old cemetery plot. He put her in the actual Pinkerton family plot at Graceland Cemetery in Chicago, which for a boss in the 1860s is like the equivalent of writing someone into your will. Like, this was a big deal and a very unusual thing to do. But he loved Kate. She was his right hand. He also spent his later writings singing her praises without a hint of restraint, calling her a detective who, quote, had no superior, end quote, and giving her credit in print publicly, repeatedly for the entire Baltimore operation, which frankly was not the norm for how men in this era treated women's contributions to anything, let alone to something this consequential. So snaps to Allan Pinkerton for being a feminist icon. And I should note that besides what I've told you today in this story, I don't know much else about Allan Pinkerton. So just throwing that out there in case someone's like, and then it came out that he did really horrible things. I don't know. But that is the story of Kate Warne, a certified boss-ass bitch. And with that, court is adjourned. Bye-bye.